So welcome back, and welcome back those of you watching online or catch up or whatever it is. So I'm going to be speaking about compassion, as I said earlier, but I would just first of all like to say, in a way echo something that Devamitra said, and that I said at the beginning. It's great to see so many of you here. I love it when the class is full. I love it when you can hardly move in here. Because if you don't know already, or you haven't worked it out, I was an actor when I was young, and you know, if the theatre was full, you knew you're going to have a great evening. If it was less than half empty, you'd have to really work to keep the audience with you. It's much easier to speak to a larger audience than it is to a smaller audience, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's just my personal vanity. The bigger the better. The bigger the auditorium, the better. I like that. So anyway, leaving my little vanity aside, let's talk about compassion. Now, let me say a few words about it, because I believe we're exploring the four Brahma Viharas over the last week or coming weeks certainly, and tonight it's the turn of compassion. I'm going to be speaking about that. So the four Brahma Viharas, these are all reflexes, you could say, of metta. So the basic positive emotion, according to Buddhism, is what we call metta, universal loving kindness, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I'm assuming you all know how to do the Metta Bhavana practice. Otherwise you wouldn't be here, presumably. But metta is really just, I would say, fundamentally an attitude towards life, the whole of existence even. Certainly it's the Buddhist attitude, the one, or at least the one that Buddhists need to cultivate, and which I've been trying to cultivate throughout my life. I became a Buddhist when I was 24. I'm now almost 74, so that's almost 50 years. And I've been practicing the Metta Bhavana throughout that whole period. And it's been a major transforming factor in my life. So metta is absolutely fundamental to Buddhist teaching and practice. But it's an active virtue. I mean, I think really pretty much all virtues are. That, you know, when metta means action, it means action on the basis of metta in response, with regards to Karuna, to compassion, in response to the sufferings of others. The other two reflexes are what we call sympathetic joy, which means being able to rejoice in the success and talents, abilities, whatever, of others, the good fortune of others. So we were able to enter into some kind of human sympathy with their fortune rather than be jealous of it, and give expression to that. That's really important. That's why we always emphasize the importance of appreciation, giving voice to your appreciation for something someone's done, etc. And then we have equanimity, which is a sort of a very even kind of metta. It's a metta which is felt equally towards all. That might seem a bit tepid, but it certainly isn't intended to be so. Equanimity is a very, very powerful emotion. It implies a high degree of emotional positivity, because it's the attitude that someone who's really, really steeped in metta, who's really thoroughly characterized by it, it's the attitude that they would bring to their life, towards other people, towards everything that lives, actually, not just other people, but all sentient beings, and even to the environment in which you live. But with regards to compassion, we're concerned more with metta when it comes into contact with human suffering. Well, I should say not human suffering, but just with suffering, because we all know that animals can suffer. There's a wonderful example from the Buddha's life. This is something he did on several occasions. I'm certainly aware of two instances where he encountered young boys, in the one case tormenting a crow with a broken wing, and in another instance, tormenting a snake that they'd trapped. And the Buddha spoke very, very kindly to them, but he said, look, if I did that to you, how would you feel? And of course he said, well, we wouldn't like it. In that way, and then he starts talking to them, and he gets them to understand that everything, every living thing is subject to pain, to suffering. You just can't avoid it. And it's not necessarily that others are to blame for this. I mean, it may simply be that you get ill. I recently had quite a serious cancer. I'm certainly not cured of that. It's still part of my existence. But, I can't blame anybody for that. It's just what life brought to me. You might think, well, it's unfair if this happens to you. Why does this happen to you? Sometimes people ask this question, which is not the most helpful question to ask, actually. But it happens simply because you live in a world in which we all suffer, and that suffering can manifest in all sorts of different ways. So everybody is subject to suffering. Every living thing is subject to suffering. So the attitude that we need to bring, that I need to bring, ideally all of us need to bring, when we encounter the suffering of others, is one of compassion. The capacity to empathize with the pain and suffering of others. And not just empathize with it, but actually do something about it. Just like the Buddha in those instances that I mentioned when the boys were tormenting the dog or tormenting the snake. So that's really what compassion means. It means certainly it's something felt, because it's the response of metta to suffering, the suffering of others. But it also implies action. So let me sort of come down from the heights, because we don't want to get too far beyond ourselves. But I'd like to give you an example of, not a very obvious example actually, but an example of compassion which struck me. And that was, I don't know if any of you saw a film made by the Lebanese film director, Nadine Labaki. She made a film called Capernaum, which is actually quite a wonderful film for a number of reasons. But she made this at the core of this film is a young boy who's a Syrian refugee in Beirut. And she had become very concerned about the plight of refugees in Lebanon, and especially, of course, in Beirut, where she lives. And so she decided, what could she do about it? Well, she could make a film which might help to bring the attention of the world onto that in a positive way. Now, there are various ways you could go about this, but what really impressed me about her was that she went about it in such a way that she didn't point a finger of blame at anyone or anything. And some of the less pleasant characters in the film, and frankly most of them are pretty unpleasant, she was able to empathize with. It was quite clear to me that as a director she'd empathized with the characters that she created. This isn't always the case with films which are concerned with any elements of, let's say, what we might call social justice. Unfortunately, because sometimes these films are made from a not very positive basis. But I felt that in this instance that was not the case. That she really felt for all the characters, for the difficulties that they faced in life. And I was really, really impressed by that. So she didn't, as I say, set out to sort of point a finger of blame at anybody, not even at the government. She just wanted to say, through her film, look, this is it. This is what's going on. And she worked for a very long time with actual refugees. She wasn't working with actors. She appeared in her own film. She tends to do that. She's an actress as well. But it was mostly non-actors who were performing in this film. People who had actually lived the life that they were portraying. and it was very, very effective. So for me, that would be an example of, in a relatively small way, I would say, of compassion in action. There are much more striking examples that I could give, but that's a fairly sort of that's compassion at the lowest level, I would say. So there was no sense of blame or being attached to anybody. It was just, this is the way it is. And actually, it's the way that life itself is. Many things that may strike us from time to time as being grossly unfair, and that's probably true. But unfairness just seems to be part of life. You know, what we come to experience in this life is determined by a whole range of factors which can never really be singled down to, you can't reduce it ever to a single cause usually. Certainly that's been my experience and observation. Now I'd like to give you a rather more spectacular example of the kind of thing that I have in mind. And it really is spectacular, and you might be surprised at this example, but it's well, in 1963, I've often talked about this because I was so struck by it, and I remember at the time when it happened, there was a Vietnamese monk called Quang Duc who immolated himself in downtown Saigon to bring the attention of the world to the severe persecution that Buddhists in Vietnam, who were by far the majority in the population, I think 80% of the population, the severe persecution that they were suffering by the Roman Catholic regime in Vietnam at that time. And I mean, if you ask people why did he do what he was doing, nearly everyone would say, oh, he's protesting against the Vietnam War. But actually, he wasn't protesting against the war at all. The war had hardly begun at that point. I mean, there certainly was an insurrection from the north and so on. But it was pretty much a few skirmishes down south in the Mekong Delta, to the south of Saigon. But what he was at this point, and I mean, things did escalate shortly after he did this, but at this point, the war was it wasn't much more than what I've just said, a few skirmishes here and there. But what he did caught the imagination of the world. The day after he'd done what he'd done, the photograph of him burning quite serenely in downtown Saigon was published. The pictures were published all over the world. Fortunately, there was one Western journalist who turned up to the immolation, Malcolm Brown, who took the famous photographs. Some of you may have seen. You may have seen the most famous of all, which appears on an album by Rage Against the Machine. So why did he do it? Well, I'm not going to go into this in any great depth. If you want to know more, I've done a film about this, which is on YouTube, on the OBC YouTube channel, filmed by a professional, a very experienced director of photography, actually, who did this with me last summer. Anyway, it's on the website, and you'll find out more about that there. But without explaining fully why, it became absolutely clear to me the more I looked into this, that what motivated him to do what he did was concern for his fellow Buddhists in Vietnam. It was even bigger than that, I would say. It was because he left a letter to President Diem asking him to have compassion on all his people, not just the Catholics. So clearly, without, as I say, going into more about this, he was moved by compassion. Now that's a very, very spectacular way to respond to the sufferings of others. Quite an extreme one, but the circumstances that they were in, believe you me, were quite extreme. So that would be another example for me of what we mean by compassion. What I don't mean by compassion, and that's a very sort of noble and almost unprecedented example. What we don't mean by compassion is sentimental pity. You see someone homeless on the street, you respond, well, you feel affected by it, but you don't do anything about it. You pity them. And it's a very quickly passing sensation usually. You don't do anything to help them. In fact, I remember one quite shocking example of this when I was walking back from a concert at the South Bank. There was someone obviously homeless sitting with a bowl in front of him, begging for money. And someone just in front of me who was walking along as well just looked at him, and he didn't. This isn't even an example of pity when I think about it. But he just looked at him and said, "It's not your fault, mate. It's the establishment's." Whatever that was supposed to mean, I don't suppose it was a great source of solace to the man concerned. But I suppose that's not exactly pity. It's just a way of dismissing the fact that you should feel any kind of responsibility for the sufferings of others. But I think it's important that we should feel moved by the sufferings and the misfortune of others in whatever circumstances we encounter them. You can probably think of many other examples, but let's get back to pity. Pity isn't really compassion. It doesn't move you to action. It tends to be shallow. And can even have an element of condescension to it, I would say. So we need to make a distinction between true compassion and merely pity. Compassion will move you to act. It doesn't have to be anything as grand as I've been talking about, of course. I mean, the example of the very simple example of the Buddhist intervention on these two instances with boys tormenting an animal. Would be a much more down-to-earth example, the sort of thing that we might be able to act upon ourselves. So that's compassion, and we'll consider that in relation to the meditation in a little while. But before we go on to any meditation, I just want to say a bit about why we're going to do that. In case you haven't already realised, negative emotion of whatsoever kind, whether it's hatred, jealousy, resentment, irritability, impatience, usually distorts our perception. Well, in fact, I would say invariably it does. If you want to see clearly, you need to come from a positive emotional base, because positive emotion does not distort. Negative emotion always does. So it's always important to bear that in mind. So that, for example, when you come to the fourth stage of the Metta Bhavana practice, you choose, of course, someone that you dislike, or you feel at least irritated with, or perhaps you feel they're irritated with you. Certainly you don't get on well with them and would prefer they weren't in your life at all, frankly, wouldn't you? There's nearly always somebody. And that person may change, or it may be a whole, if you're unfortunate, it might be quite a few people. But there's always somebody of that kind. Now, very often we only see half the picture. Maybe they have behaved a little bit badly towards us, maybe they've not. It's very easy to mistake people's behaviour, by the way. I think a lot of the sort of disharmony between people is a result of misunderstanding, or misreading, miscommunication. Reading into others' actions something that they don't really intend at all. So it's a bit important to bear all that in mind. But the key thing when it comes to doing the fourth stage of the Metta Bhavana practice to remember is that whoever you place in that stage is subject to pain and suffering, just as you yourself are, just as I am. They must be, because everybody suffers. I don't care how much money, how much power in the world they've got. They will suffer. That's guaranteed. So everybody will suffer. And if we really want to help to make at least some difference to the world, bring a little bit more emotional positivity to it, we need to be able to empathize with that. There's another very striking film I'd like to mention. I showed this on one of our film nights here sometime before lockdown, a film called Fog of War, which is a film basically about the life of Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara was John F. Kennedy's defense secretary at the time of the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he draws 10 lessons from life. And, you know, the US Defense Secretary clearly was a very, very powerful man. He was responsible for a lot, which I think he came later to regret. But one of his lessons, which he made quite a bit of actually, said, empathize with your enemy. And this is a big mistake that is often made. You don't empathize with your enemy. And of course, in this instance, he was talking about partly about the Russians, because he was dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also, I suppose, the Cubans by implication, and also the Vietnamese, certainly the communist Vietnamese. And this was one of the mistakes that, as a much younger man, he made, and he felt this was a lesson he'd learned from life. Empathize with your enemy. Well, of course, he's talking about that on the sort of geopolitical stage on which he played his life to some extent, you could say. But we can take a lesson from that ourselves. If there's someone that you find very difficult, perhaps you even hate, well, empathize with them. Just try a little bit of empathy. Try to understand their point of view. Oh, if I had done that when I was younger, I'd have saved myself so much trouble. And saved others, no doubt, a fair amount of pain too. Because it doesn't come naturally and easily to us. But just try, if you can, to empathize with your enemy, whoever they are. Because there's usually goodness in everybody. I won't say more than that, really. Okay, so that's the theme for this evening. So we're going to do a shortened version of the Metta, in which I'll incorporate something of that, but we're not going to do it just yet. I'd like first of all just to pause and make sure, well, in fact, invite any questions you might have of anything that I've said this evening. I've said rather more than I intended, but we've still got plenty of time because the announcements this evening were very brief, very succinct to the point, and very nicely done, but it meant I had an extra 10 minutes to speak.
Something, I guess, like with the word hate, I mean, because I can't really think of anyone I hate, but like maybe more like being like addicted to in a negative way. Like, how would you use that in Metta?
Well, let's go back to your first statement. There's no one that you hate. Have you considered everyone in your family?
I've got many reasons to hate, but it doesn't feel like it's more like attachment that can't be healed.
Well, I think there certainly is attachment to hatred. I think we become very attached to those we hate. That's why we think so much about them. If there's no attachment there, we wouldn't. But Buddhism speaks of 3 primary negative emotions: greed, hatred, and delusion. So attachment would be a manifestation of greed, and of course hatred is hatred, and there are many manifestations of hatred, from very mild hatred to minor and petty resentments, for example, right through to I want to kill him or her or whoever it is. And every human being has that capacity. Every human being is capable of killing another, believe me. Every human being is capable of intense hatred. So don't trick yourself into thinking that you're not capable of that. You are capable of it. I hope you're not in that mood at the moment. But the point is that these two things are very intimately connected, because fundamentally Craving, which is attachment is a manifestation, is like a pulling something towards you, and you can do this with an enemy. And aversion is the pushing away. You don't want that person in your life. You don't want that experience in your life. Craving, you want that experience in your life. You want it to be part of your life. But so this is like an underlying dynamic of existence, at least according to Buddhist analysis. So it doesn't surprise me when you say, well, you feel a certain kind of attachment, but dig deeper underneath the attachment and see what comes up. That's all I can suggest. Think about it anyway.
Can I ask something in relation to that?
Sorry, well, oh yeah, sure.
Sorry. So, in terms of the opposite, so how do you create love without forming attachment?
By developing metta. No. Let me unpack that a bit. I mean, that's a very glib response. And I don't mean it in that way. Very often, what we confuse love. We think of love in a way which may not be compatible with what I talk about when I speak about metta. Very often, we identify love as being something that we feel for one other person, especially in the case of romantic love, or just those who are very close to you, your immediate family maybe, or your very close friends. But metta is not exclusive in that way. I mean, if you could bring the force of love that you can feel, let's say, that a mother can feel for her child, and if you can feel that and extend it towards everyone, well, that would be what we might consider to be metta, because it's not exclusive. But very often the love that we feel is exclusive. So we have to develop an all-inclusive love, and that's why we do this meditation practice, and that's why we when we say we give certain conditions, don't we, for the second stage of the practice, so that we're trying to get some feel for a love which is not attached, but is simply an attitude that we bring to our interaction with others, or even with the world at large. Does that get to the question? Yeah. I think I've been saying this more and more recently because it's just struck me more and more forcibly. But with the meditation practice, and especially with the Metta Bhavana practice, don't expect instantaneous results. We're very impatient for instantaneous results because of Amazon Prime, isn't it? And the next morning, it doesn't work like that with meditation. It certainly doesn't like that with metta. For many years, I promise you, I felt that my Metta Bhavana practice just wasn't working. But as I think it's because I just did not understand how subtle the effects of the practice are, and how gradually we change. Because what we're trying to change are very, very deep-seated habits, habitual ways of interacting with other people, with the world, etc. And these things are very, very deeply rooted in our psyche, and to uproot them is not gonna happen very quickly. So you have to be patient, and also try to just bear in mind what I've said, that the effects can be quite subtle. But I think that you can notice this. I often ask people at the end of the beginner's class, where when we've done the Metta Bhavana, I ask, can you remember how you felt when you came in at the beginning of the class? And then I said, can you notice the difference now that you're leaving? And they almost invariably say yes. They nod, yes, of course, but it's not necessarily anything dramatic. But they know there's been a slight shift. So to develop a love which is free from attachment is not an easy thing, but it's not an impossible thing. But you must be patient and you must apply yourself. A much longer answer to your question, right at the back. You've been trying for some time.
Yes, considering your story about the Cuban Missile Crisis and inevitably 60 years onwards, the actions as of current of the Russians, would you say that the phrase "empathize with your enemy" is even more paramount today, even though we also at the same time consider.
I think it must be. I think McNamara was dead right, because I remember talking with a Russian friend about the whole period of the Cold War, which I lived through. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he said, well, you must remember, people had a very, very negative view of the Soviet Union, and I mean, for some reason, for quite good reasons, but the Russians were really quite, I think, paranoid about the fact, and understandably, because they were surrounded by missile bases in Europe. That's partly how the Cuban Missile Crisis came about. They wanted to get missiles in Cuba, so the Americans would feel the pinch too. But what the Americans at that time failed to understand was that, Russia felt hemmed in. There were missile bases in Turkey, there were US air bases all over this country, a lot of them carrying nuclear missiles and so on. There were bases in Germany. All the missiles were pointing towards Russia. No wonder they felt sort of under pressure. Now, what the equivalent situation might be in Russia in relation to the West at the moment, I don't know. I'm afraid I don't keep up with political developments very thoroughly. But wherever there's empathy between, on both sides, surely it must take some of the heat out of it. So I think it's very important. I think Robert McNamara really put his finger on something very, very valuable there. Yeah.
I don't know, but it was surely when Chamberlain went and did appeasement with Hitler before the war, that was an example of being too empathetic with the
I
enemy.
don't think he was being empathetic at all. Sorry, I wouldn't agree with that assessment of Chamberlain. I think he's just being weak
Right.
and frightened. Probably frightened. Because they must have.
What I'm asking is there a limit? Are there not monsters that you don't want to generate empathy towards?
Well, let's say I think there's always, as a general principle, I think it's important to try to empathise. There may be exceptions to any rule. I'd have to think more about your question, but leaving aside the extreme situation of Europe in the 30s, I think it's important to bear in mind to empathise with your enemy, if for no other reason that the better you understand them, and if there's empathy, you're more likely to understand them, the better are your chances of success. I think that's part of the point that McNamara was making. However, look, it's getting rather late. I want you to do some more meditation before you go. So what we're going to do, at least what I'm going to suggest you do, is we'll do the first stage of the metta, very, very briefly, not for long. And then the second stage, we're going to move straight in to the enemy or the difficult person, and then we'll finish up with a slightly attenuated third stage. But what I'd like you to do, and if this is too strong for you, you don't have to. You could just put a good friend there if you feel you don't want to do it. But you might like to try in this, in the enemy stage, which will be the second stage of what we're going to do. You might like to try just bringing to mind whoever it is most frequently occurs in that fourth slot, and trying to empathise with them, trying to understand that they too, like you, are subject to pain and subject to suffering. And try somehow to feel positively towards them from that base. So that's all we're going to do. So it will be a longer middle stage, which will be the fourth stage. And then that will be the end of the evening. Okay, so you all seem pretty much set up for meditation. I'll just turn the overhead lights off. Remember how to, that's it. Good. Okay, so just settling down into your posture. Watching your breath for a few moments. And then developing a positive emotional attitude towards yourself. Now, bring to mind the enemy or the difficult person. They too are subject to suffering. May they be free from suffering. radiating metta in all directions, in widening and widening circles. that's all there is time for this evening. We'll be back here next week. At least someone will be. I won't be. I'll be in Brixton doing a book launch. I'll send, well, not exactly centre, the place we use for our activities down there. Okay, so see you again soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.